That's the only goal.
But Daniel's messages revealed something even more disturbing. He admitted that he had been present during conversations where the family had discussed what to do about the situation. He described meetings where strategies were developed, stories were coordinated, and plans were made. This wasn't just about lying to protect someone, this was about active participation in a conspiracy. The leaked messages also revealed the depth of Daniel's knowledge about the family's movements after the children disappeared. He knew about safe houses, about people who were helping, about money that had been moved. He had been privy to conversations about escape routes and contingency plans. This wasn't the knowledge of an innocent bystander. This was the knowledge of someone who had been part of the planning. Perhaps most chillingly, Daniel admitted that he had been asked to provide false testimony and had initially agreed. He had been coached on what to say, how to say it, and what details to emphasize or omit. The entire public narrative that had been constructed around the children's disappearance had been carefully orchestrated, and Daniel had been one of the key architects. But the messages also revealed Daniel's growing discomfort with the role he had been asked to play. He described feeling increasingly guilty about the lies he was telling, increasingly worried about the consequences of his actions, and increasingly afraid that the truth would eventually come out. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. The turning point, according to Daniel's messages, came when he realized that his own daughter might be in danger. Malaya's erratic behavior, her threats of suicide, her violation of CPS protocols, all of it had combined to make Daniel question whether protecting her was worth the risk to Meadow. For the first time, his paternal instincts had overridden his romantic loyalty. The messages also revealed specific details about what Daniel claimed to know about the children's whereabouts. He suggested that Jack and Lily were being hidden by extended family members, that they were being moved regularly to avoid detection, and that the entire disappearance had been staged to look like an abduction or accident. But perhaps the most devastating revelation in Daniel's messages was his admission that he believed the children were still alive. If true, this meant that every day of delay, every misdirection, every lie had been time stolen from two innocent children who were being kept from their family and their normal lives. The reaction to Daniel's leaked messages was swift and intense. People who had been following the case felt betrayed, angry, and heartbroken. The man who had presented himself as a grieving father figure had revealed himself to be complicit in a conspiracy that had wasted resources, misled investigators, and potentially prolonged the suffering of two children. But the messages also raised new questions. If Daniel was telling the truth now, why should anyone believe him? How could someone who had lied for months suddenly be trusted? And if his motivations were truly about protecting his daughter, why had he waited so long to speak out? The answers to these questions would come in the most unexpected way possible, through the testimony of someone who had been there from the beginning, someone who had seen everything, and someone whose words would finally provide the missing piece of the puzzle. In any missing persons case, investigators hope for that one crucial witness who can provide the breakthrough they need. But in the case of Jack and Lily Sullivan, that witness came from the most unexpected source, a neighbor who had been largely overlooked until her testimony changed everything. Janie lived close enough to the Sullivan household to hear what was happening, but far enough away that she hadn't been considered a primary witness. She was going about her normal morning routine when she heard something that would haunt her for months: the sound of children screaming. What made Janie's testimony so compelling wasn't just what she heard, but when she heard it. The screaming occurred in the early morning hours, well before Daniel and Malaya claimed to have discovered the children were missing. This meant that something terrible had happened to Jack and Lily hours before their parents allegedly noticed they were gone. But Janie's testimony went beyond just the screaming. She described hearing what sounded like a struggle, followed by an eerie silence that lasted for hours. In a neighborhood where children's voices were a constant background noise, this sudden quiet was more disturbing than any sound could have been. The most damning piece of physical evidence came from Janie's own property. While helping with the search efforts, investigators found a boot print in the mud near her fence line. The print was fresh, made sometime during the night or early morning hours when the children disappeared. More importantly, it was heading away from the Sullivan property, not toward it. This boot print contradicted everything Daniel and Malaya had claimed about the children wandering off on their own. If someone had been walking away from the house in the early morning hours, it suggested that the children hadn't left voluntarily. Someone had taken them, and that someone had been trying to avoid detection. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Janie's testimony was what happened when search dogs were brought to investigate the boot print. The dogs, trained to track human scent, were able to follow a trail from the Sullivan house to the location of the boot print. But then, inexplicably, the scent trail ended. The abrupt end of the scent trail suggested that the children had been loaded into a vehicle at that location. It meant that their disappearance had been planned, coordinated, and executed with the help of transportation that was waiting for them. This wasn't a random abduction or a tragic accident. This was a carefully orchestrated operation. The timing of the scent trail also correlated perfectly with Janie's testimony about the screaming. The sound she heard in the early morning hours aligned with when the dogs indicated the children had been moved through that area. For the first time, investigators had a witness account that matched the physical evidence. But Janie's testimony also revealed something that had been bothering investigators from the beginning: the complete absence of any evidence that the children had actually entered the woods. Despite extensive searches, no torn clothing, no footprints, no signs of passage had been found. The forest had been combed by professionals, volunteers, and search dogs, but it was as if Jack and Lily had never been there at all. This absence of evidence now made perfect sense. The children had never gone into the woods because they had never been taken in that direction. They had been moved along a completely different route, one that led away from the house and toward a waiting vehicle. The extensive forest searches had been based on a lie, and Janie's testimony proved it. The boot print analysis also revealed crucial information about the perpetrator. The size and tread pattern suggested an adult male, someone who was physically capable of carrying or controlling two small children. The depth of the print indicated someone who was bearing additional weight, consistent with carrying a child or children. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Janie's testimony was what it revealed about the planning involved. The route taken to avoid her property, the timing to minimize the chances of being seen, the presence of a getaway vehicle. All of it suggested someone who was familiar with the area and had carefully planned the operation. The coordination required for this operation also suggested multiple people were involved. One person to control the children, another to drive the vehicle, possibly others to provide support or create alibis. This wasn't the work of a single individual acting impulsively. This was a conspiracy that required planning, resources, and coordination. Janie's testimony also explained why Daniel and Malaya had waited so long to report the children missing. They needed time for the operation to be completed, for the children to be moved to their final destination, and for any immediate evidence to be disposed of. The delayed timeline wasn't confusion or negligence. It was part of the plan. The psychological impact of Janie's testimony on the case cannot be overstated. For months, people had been operating under the assumption that the children had wandered off, been abducted by a stranger, or had met with some kind of accident. But Janie's account revealed that their disappearance had been intentional, planned, and executed by people they knew and trusted. This revelation transformed the entire investigation. Instead of searching for missing children, investigators were now searching for children who had been deliberately hidden. Instead of looking for evidence of an accident or a random crime, they were looking for evidence of a conspiracy. And instead of treating the parents as victims, they were treating them as suspects. But Janie's testimony also provided something that had been missing from the case since the beginning: hope. If the children had been taken by people who knew them, there was a chance they were still alive. If this had been a planned operation rather than a violent crime, there was a possibility that Jack and Lily were being cared for somewhere. The question now wasn't just what had happened to the children, but where they were being hidden and who was helping to hide them. The investigation had shifted from a search and rescue operation to a complex conspiracy case that potentially involved multiple family members, friends, and accomplices. As investigators began to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy, they realized that Daniel's eventual confession had been just the tip of the iceberg. The truth about what happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan was more complex, more disturbing, and more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. With Janie's testimony providing a new framework for understanding the case, investigators began to deconstruct Daniel and Malaya's timeline with forensic precision. What they discovered was a carefully constructed lie that unraveled completely when examined against the physical evidence and witness accounts. The official timeline, as presented by Daniel and Malaya, claimed that they discovered the children were missing at 9:40 a.m. This was supposedly the moment when they began to panic when they realized something was wrong, and when they started searching for Jack and Lily. But every piece of evidence contradicted this claim. Janie's testimony placed the critical events in the early morning hours, possibly as early as 6 a.m. The screaming she heard, the sounds of struggle, the movement of people through the area, all of it occurred hours before Daniel and Malaya claimed to have any knowledge that something was wrong. This meant they had been lying about the timeline from the very beginning. But the timeline problems went deeper than just the discovery time. The 6:18 a.m. phone call to the school, reporting the children's absence, proved that Malaya had known hours in advance that Jack and Lily wouldn't be attending school that day. This wasn't a reactive decision made after discovering they were missing. This was a planned absence that had been arranged before the children disappeared. The significance of this cannot be overstated. If Malaya was calling the school at 6:18 a.m. to report the children's absence, it meant she knew at that time that they wouldn't be available for school. The only logical explanation was that she knew they were going to disappear because she was part of the plan to make them disappear. Daniel's later admission to Darren, a family member, finally provided the missing piece of the timeline puzzle. When confronted about the inconsistencies, Daniel broke down and confessed that he had been lying about the discovery time. He admitted that he had known all along that the children hadn't gone into the woods and that he had been deliberately misleading the search efforts. But Daniel's confession revealed something even more disturbing. He told Darren that the entire morning had been a performance, carefully orchestrated to create the appearance of parental concern while actually covering up what had really happened. The timeline hadn't been confused or misremembered. It had been fabricated. The most heartbreaking aspect of Daniel's confession was his explanation for why he had maintained the lie for so long. When asked why he would mislead searchers and waste precious time that could have been used to find the children, Daniel's response was both simple and devastating. "I still love Malaya, and I was trying to cover for her lie." This admission revealed the true nature of Daniel's loyalty. He had been willing to sacrifice the safety of 2 innocent children to protect the woman he loved. He had been willing to mislead investigators, waste resources, and obstruct justice because his romantic feelings had overridden his moral obligations. But Daniel's confession also revealed the depth of his knowledge about what had really happened. He knew the children hadn't gone into the woods because he knew where they had actually gone. He knew the timeline was false because he had been part of creating the false timeline. He knew the search efforts were futile because he knew the children weren't in the areas being searched. The revelation of Daniel's knowledge transformed him from a potential suspect to a confirmed conspirator. He hadn't just been lying to protect Malaya, he had been actively participating in a cover-up that had potentially endangered 2 children. His love for Malaya had turned him into an accomplice in whatever had happened to Jack and Lily. The timeline reconstruction also revealed the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy. The early morning phone call to the school, the delayed reporting of the disappearance, the misdirection of search efforts, all of it had been coordinated to buy time and create confusion. This wasn't a spontaneous cover-up of an accident. This was a planned operation with multiple moving parts. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the timeline was what it revealed about the children's experience. If Janie's testimony was accurate, Jack and Lily had been awake and aware of what was happening to them. They had been frightened enough to scream, which suggested they understood that something terrible was occurring. They had been conscious victims of whatever had been done to them. The timeline also revealed the calculated cruelty of the conspiracy. While Jack and Lily were experiencing whatever trauma had caused them to scream, the adults responsible were already implementing their cover-up plan. The phone call to the school was made while the children were potentially still in distress, which showed a level of cold calculation that was almost incomprehensible. Daniel's eventual confession about the timeline didn't just expose his own lies, it exposed the entire foundation of the case. Everything that had been presented as fact was actually fiction. Everything that had been searched was actually misdirection. Everything that had been believed was actually deception. The question now wasn't just what had happened to the children, but how many people had been involved in creating and maintaining the false timeline. The sophistication of the deception suggested that this wasn't just about Daniel and Malaya. It was about a larger network of people who had been willing to participate in a conspiracy that had potentially cost 2 children their lives. As investigators began to unravel the true timeline, they realized that the case was far more complex than they had initially understood. The disappearance of Jack and Lily Sullivan wasn't just about missing children. It was about a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had involved multiple people, extensive planning, and a level of deception that had fooled investigators, volunteers, and the public for months. The timeline that didn't add up had finally revealed the truth. Jack and Lily Sullivan hadn't disappeared by accident. They hadn't been abducted by strangers, and they hadn't wandered off into the woods. They had been taken by people they knew, people who had planned their disappearance, and people who had been willing to lie about it for months. The question that haunted everyone who followed the Sullivan case was simple yet profound. At what point does love become complicity? Daniel Martell's confession forced us to confront this uncomfortable truth about human nature, that the people we care about most can sometimes drive us to betray our most fundamental moral principles. Daniel's journey from devoted boyfriend to criminal accomplice didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion of boundaries, a slow descent into moral compromise that began with small lies and ended with the betrayal of 2 innocent children. Understanding this progression is crucial to understanding how such a terrible conspiracy could have been sustained for so long. In Daniel's own words, his motivation was simple. "I still love Malaya, and I was trying to cover for her lie." This statement, while devastating in its implications, reveals something important about the psychology of complicity. Daniel didn't set out to harm Jack and Lily. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to obstruct justice. He made a series of small compromises that eventually led him to become an accessory to their disappearance. The first compromise was probably the easiest, staying silent when he should have spoken up. Maybe Malaya told him something that didn't make sense, or maybe he noticed something that seemed suspicious. But instead of asking questions or demanding answers, he chose to trust her. This initial act of faith, while understandable, was the first step down a path that would ultimately lead to his betrayal of the children. The second compromise was likely more difficult, actively participating in the deception. This might have involved making the phone call to the school, helping to establish the false timeline, or agreeing to mislead investigators. Each act of participation made it harder for Daniel to back out, harder to claim innocence, and harder to do the right thing. But the most damaging compromise was the ongoing one, maintaining the lie day after day, week after week, month after month. Every time Daniel appeared on television, every time he joined a search party, every time he spoke to investigators, he was making a choice to prioritize his love for Malaya over his concern for Jack and Lily. The psychological toll of this ongoing deception was evident in Daniel's behavior. His awkwardness in interviews, his inappropriate emotional responses, his inability to maintain eye contact. All of it suggested someone who was struggling with the weight of what he knew. The performance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain because it was fundamentally at odds with his conscience. But Daniel's complicity went beyond just lying. His active participation in misdirecting search efforts meant that he was directly responsible for wasting resources that could have been used to find the children. Every hour that volunteers spent searching the woods was an hour that could have been spent following real leads. Every dollar spent on false search efforts was a dollar that could have been used for legitimate investigation. The cruelty of Daniel's actions becomes even clearer when we consider the impact on the children's extended family. While Belinda, their grandmother, was desperately trying to find answers, Daniel was deliberately avoiding her questions and maintaining the very deception that was preventing her from understanding what had happened to her grandchildren. His silence wasn't just callous, it was actively harmful. Daniel's behavior also revealed the selfish nature of his love for Malaya. True love would have involved protecting her by encouraging her to tell the truth, seeking help for her if she was struggling, and ensuring that she didn't face the consequences of her actions alone. Instead, Daniel's version of love involved enabling her deception, participating in her conspiracy, and allowing her to dig herself deeper into legal and moral trouble. The transformation of Daniel from potential ally to confirmed accomplice demonstrates how loyalty can become toxic when it's not balanced with moral principle. His commitment to protecting Malaya had overridden his commitment to protecting the children, his commitment to helping the investigation, and his commitment to telling the truth. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Daniel's complicity was its duration. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a single bad decision. This was a sustained campaign of deception that lasted for months. Every day that passed was another day that Daniel chose to prioritize his relationship with Malaya over his responsibility to Jack and Lily. The question of whether Daniel's actions were motivated by love or by self-preservation is complex. While he claimed to be protecting Malaya, he was also protecting himself. As an accomplice to the conspiracy, he had his own legal exposure to consider. His continued participation in the deception may have been as much about avoiding consequences as it was about protecting the woman he loved. The case also raises questions about the nature of love itself. Can love that requires the sacrifice of innocent children really be called love? Can a relationship that demands complicity in potential crimes really be healthy? Daniel's actions suggest that his feelings for Malaya had become obsessive and destructive rather than nurturing and protective. The moment when Daniel's loyalty finally cracked was revealing. It wasn't concern for Jack and Lily that eventually drove him to tell the truth. It was concern for his own daughter, Meadow. His paternal instincts had finally overridden his romantic loyalty, but only when his own child was at risk. This suggests that Daniel's moral compass, while damaged, wasn't completely broken. Daniel's eventual confession was both a moment of moral clarity and a tragic acknowledgement of how far he had fallen. By admitting his complicity, he was finally choosing to do the right thing, but he was also admitting that he had been choosing to do the wrong thing for months. The case of Daniel Martell serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unconditional loyalty. While love and loyalty are generally positive qualities, they become destructive when they're not tempered by moral principle. Daniel's love for Malaya had become a form of moral blindness that prevented him from seeing the harm he was causing to innocent children. As we'll see in the final part of this story, Daniel's confession opened the door to understanding what really happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan. But his journey from devoted boyfriend to criminal accomplice also revealed something important about human nature, that good people can do terrible things when they convince themselves that love justifies betrayal. The question that remains is whether Daniel's eventual honesty was enough to redeem his months of deception, and whether his confession would finally lead to the truth about what happened to two innocent children who trusted the adults in their lives to protect them. As we reach the end of this investigation into the disappearance of Jack and Lily Sullivan, we're left with more questions than answers. Daniel Martell's confession has torn away the veil of deception that had hidden the truth for months, but it has also revealed a conspiracy so complex and disturbing that the full truth may never be known. What we know for certain is that everything we were told about the morning of April 30th was a lie. The children didn't wander off into the woods. They weren't abducted by strangers. They weren't the victims of a tragic accident. They were taken by people they knew, people who had planned their disappearance, and people who had been willing to lie about it for months. Daniel's confession has confirmed what many suspected but couldn't prove, that the entire search effort was based on false information. The hundreds of volunteers who gave up their time to search the forest were looking in the wrong place because they had been deliberately misled. The resources that were spent on false leads were resources that could have been used to find the children if they were still alive. But Daniel's confession has also raised new questions that may be even more disturbing than the original mystery. If he was telling the truth about the family conspiracy, if Jack and Lily are being hidden rather than harmed, then where are they now?
Who is caring for them?
And why hasn't anyone come forward to end their separation from the people who love them? The possibility that the children are still alive is both hopeful and heartbreaking. If they're being hidden, it means they may eventually be found and returned to their family. But it also means that every day they remain hidden is another day of trauma, another day of confusion, another day of being kept from the people who love them most. The psychological impact on Jack and Lily, if they are still alive, cannot be overstated. They were 4 and 6 years old when they disappeared, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening to them, old enough to remember their real family, old enough to be traumatized by their separation. If they're being told that their disappearance was necessary, that their family didn't want them, or that they're in danger, the psychological damage could be irreparable. The case has also revealed the devastating impact of conspiracy on criminal investigations. When multiple people coordinate to mislead investigators, when false timelines are created, when evidence is planted or destroyed, when witnesses are coached or silenced, the entire foundation of the investigation is compromised. The Sullivan case demonstrates how easily the truth can be buried when enough people are willing to lie. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is what it reveals about the willingness of adults to sacrifice children for their own purposes. Whether those purposes were avoiding criminal charges, protecting family reputation, or maintaining custody arrangements, the fact remains that Jack and Lily were treated as pawns in an adult game rather than as innocent victims who deserved protection. The role of social media and online communities in this case has been both helpful and harmful. While online discussion helped keep the case in the public eye and may have contributed to Daniel's eventual confession, it also created an environment where rumors, speculation, and false information could spread rapidly. The line between investigation and vigilantism became blurred, and the children's story became entertainment for people who had no real connection to their suffering. The failure of the system to protect Jack and Lily is also evident in this case. Despite clear inconsistencies in the timeline, despite suspicious behavior from the adults involved, despite physical evidence that contradicted the official story, the investigation seemed to stall. Whether this was due to resource constraints, jurisdictional issues, or other factors, the fact remains that 2 children were failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Daniel's eventual confession, while crucial for understanding what happened, may have come too late to save the children. If Jack and Lily were being hidden, if they were moved regularly to avoid detection, if they were being kept by people who were committed to never letting them be found, then Daniel's honesty may not be enough to bring them home. The case also raises questions about the nature of justice in cases involving missing children. Even if everyone involved in the conspiracy is eventually identified and prosecuted, even if the full truth is revealed, even if the children are found and returned, the damage that has been done cannot be undone. The trauma, the separation, the lies, the betrayal, none of it can be erased by legal consequences. But perhaps the most important lesson from this case is about the power of truth. Daniel's confession, while devastating in its implications, has finally allowed investigators to understand what really happened. It has shifted the focus from searching for missing children to searching for hidden children. It has transformed a mystery into a conspiracy case. And it has provided hope that the truth, no matter how buried, can eventually be uncovered. The search for Jack and Lily Sullivan continues, but it's no longer a search based on lies and misdirection. It's a search based on truth, evidence, and the understanding that these children were taken by people who knew them. Whether they're found alive or dead, whether their captors are brought to justice or escape consequences, the truth about what happened to them will eventually emerge. For Belinda, their grandmother, for the volunteers who searched for them, for the investigators who were misled, for the community that was deceived, Daniel's confession has provided both closure and heartbreak. Closure because they finally understand what happened. Heartbreak because they understand what was done to 2 innocent children by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The case of Jack and Lily Sullivan is far from over. Daniel's confession was not an ending, it was a beginning. The beginning of a new investigation based on truth rather than lies. The beginning of a search for hidden children rather than missing children. The beginning of a conspiracy case rather than a missing persons case. But it's also a reminder that in cases involving missing children, time is always the enemy. Every day that passes is another day that evidence disappears, memories fade, and trails go cold. Every day that passes is another day that children suffer, that families grieve, and that justice is delayed. The truth about what happened to Jack and Lily Sullivan is still hidden, but it's no longer buried under a mountain of lies. Daniel's confession has cleared away the deception and revealed the conspiracy. Now it's up to investigators, with the help of the community and the courage of other potential witnesses, to follow the truth wherever it leads. Whether that truth leads to a reunion with 2 living children or to the recovery of 2 small bodies, whether it leads to justice for those responsible or to the bitter acceptance that some crimes go unpunished, the search for Jack and Lily Sullivan will continue. Because some truths are too important to remain hidden. Some children are too precious to be forgotten. And some crimes are too terrible to be ignored. If this case has taught us anything, it's that the truth always finds a way to emerge, even when it's buried under months of lies. Daniel's confession has started that process. Now we must see it through to the end, wherever that end may be. If cases like this matter to you, if you believe that truth and justice are worth fighting for, if you think that innocent children deserve better than to be pawns in adult games, then hit that subscribe button now. Because stories like this need to be told, shared, and remembered until justice is finally served. The search for Jack and Lily Sullivan continues. And we'll be here to cover every development, every breakthrough, and every step toward the truth they deserve.